Well, thank you so much for showing up on a very cold, blustery winter day, and we'll fare forward further into the themes of Kierkegaard's authorship today. Notice once again you have two handouts in your seat. There is an outline of the now four presentations I'm going to be giving at this time on the next 3 Sundays, including today. And there's also a handout with texts from various works of Kierkegaard that I'm going to be reading from, we're going to be pondering. And if we finish the topics of the outline for today, then you can take the texts home. If not, you can hand them in. I would also appreciate if you could hand in the outlines to the outline handout, because we're going to use that again in subsequent sessions. So I'm going to begin so that we can cover a whole lot more ground, and I'll pause for questions and comments as we proceed as well. And so if you take out your outline handout, we're on Roman numeral 2, a Kierkegaard lexicon today, and we're going to begin with a very brief review of what we said last time under this heading, and then get going with some further topics. So it's under Roman numeral 2, a Kierkegaard lexicon. I'm calling this a lexicon because I am articulating some of the most basic categories in Kierkegaard's thought, some of the most basic concepts and themes, and they're all integrally related. They're all organically related, as I think you'll see. You began to see that more last time, I think even more today. So there are two questions that generate these themes, these categories, if you will, under two leading questions. We covered this last time. These are the two central questions of Kierkegaard's authorship. What does it mean to become an existing individual? Talk a little bit more about that concept of existing individual in a bit, so I'm not going to spend too much time reviewing it. I said a bit last time. But the key words there, of course, are existing and individual. Individual doesn't mean individualism. It means being a unique self, a unique subject, a unique human being with a unique vocation before God. Expression you find in many different locations in Kierkegaard's authorship, before God. And existing means we're in process, a process of becoming a self through our concrete choices and actions in time. And a coordinate question is, what does it mean to become a Christian? Becoming a Christian in time means that this is a process of conformity to Christ, or conforming our lives to the one who articulated a way, a truth, and a life on our behalf. The God-man, as Kierkegaard calls Jesus. And again, the key concept there is becoming, a temporal process. And those two becomings are interrelated. Becoming a unique self before God has everything to do with our call to follow Christ. And our call to follow Christ has everything to do with becoming a human being in the fullest sense. All right, that's a little bit of review. The next topic, the corrective, we also looked at last time. Kierkegaard offers his authorship, his entire career as a Christian thinker, as a corrective to certain imbalances and abuses that he perceived in Denmark in the 19th century. And we looked at one of them last time, and that is what Kierkegaard calls Christendom. And by Christendom is meant this Constantinian version of Christianity. Christianity as a nationalistic cultural phenomenon. And in Denmark, in Kierkegaard's day, there was an established church. It was the Lutheran Church. And just by being a good citizen of Denmark and being a good patriotic citizen, you were accounted to be a Christian, because isn't everyone in this society, in this culture? So Christendom is a kind of Christian nationalism, if you will, maybe not as aggressive as and as malevolent as the Christian nationalisms we're encountering these days in the United States. It was more benign, more typically Danish, kind of cozy, kind of convivial, but it nevertheless had this problem of confusing being a Christian with being a part of a Christian culture and a Christian nation and being a good citizen. Now, there were other religious minorities other than the Lutheran Church and so on, but it was pretty monolithically a Lutheran culture. And we don't need to say anything more about that. We need to go on to the next bit where Kierkegaard is offering a corrective to an imbalance or a corrective to an abuse. And in this case, it's under the rubric of speculative philosophy. Now, Kierkegaard is a great philosopher. Kierkegaard is not anti-intellectual or anti-philosophy and so on, but he does call some shots about the deceptions, the self-deceptions that can orbit around speculative thinking. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about what kinds of speculation and philosophical discourse that he's talking about, but the key name here is G.W.F. Hegel. He was the 19th century massively influential philosopher in Europe, particularly in Germany. He is of the school of thought known as German idealism. And we can't pause. We had 3 weeks. I paused to unpack why Kierkegaard has problems with Hegel's philosophy and why he identifies Hegel's philosophy, which he learned in his trip to Berlin and he learned under the theological faculty at the seminary in Copenhagen. I'd unpack for you what the problems are with Hegel's philosophy. I can't do that. We just don't have enough time. So I'm going to revert to what Kierkegaard says in general about the speculative frame of mind. And again, as Kierkegaard himself puts it, all honor to theoretical reflection. But theoretical reflection, philosophical thinking, the big questions pursued rationally according to certain logical methods of inquiry and so on, that's fine. All honor to it, says Kierkegaard, but there's a deception there. It can call us away from the two tasks of becoming an existing individual in full and becoming a follower of Christ. Entering the world of speculative thinking is a little bit like entering a hall of mirrors, reflection upon reflection upon reflection, and you can lose your way. It can become really difficult to get back to the concretely actual, to the task of becoming an existing individual. So Kierkegaard's point of critique of speculative philosophy is that theoretical reflection abridges and distorts concrete existence and calls us away from the heavy responsibility of negotiating this process of becoming a self, a human being, in full, in time. I'd like to read a text in your little booklet text. It's text number 3. This is from the concluding unscientific postscript, one of Kierkegaard's most read and most important works. And so find text number 3 from concluding unscientific postscript. And here Kierkegaard, under the pseudonym of Johannes Climacus, we'll talk about pseudonyms in due course, articulates what some of the problems are with Hegelian philosophy in particular and speculative thinking in general. The difficulty that inheres in existence with which the existing individual is confronted is one that never really comes to expression in the language of abstract thought, much less receives an explanation. The key word there is abstract. Reflective, theoretical, speculative thinking, it has to be abstract. That's fine. But we can get so called away from our calling of becoming a full-fledged human being that we can sort of be forgetful that we even exist. But let's read on. Abstract thought ignores the concrete and the temporal. Now that's controversial. As a philosopher myself who has taught the theory of knowledge, epistemology, I would disagree with that point. But let's just let Kierkegaard unfold his perspective here. Abstract thought ignores the concrete and the temporal, the existential process, the process of becoming an existing individual, the predicament of the existing individual arising from his being a synthesis of the temporal and the eternal. Pause here. Big concept in Kierkegaard. One of the most important is the concept of paradox. He is a thinker that revels in paradox, and there are going to be two chief paradoxes. The second I'll talk about in due course. The first is the paradox of human existence itself. Human existence lived out in time, but oriented towards eternity. So we're called to transcend ourselves towards God, but we also have to keep our feet on the ground and negotiate our existence in time. And there's a tension there, a paradox. We'll talk more about that later. One must therefore be very careful in dealing with a philosopher of the speculative type, like Hegel, for instance, and above all, to make certain of the identity of the one with whom one has the honor to discourse. Now, Kierkegaard's going to get a little ironical, a bit snarky here. Is he a human being, an existing individual, this speculative philosopher? Is he sub specie aeterni? What does that mean? Well, does he enjoy the perspective of eternity, even when he sleeps, eats, blows his nose, or whatever else a human being does? Does he in fact exist? And if he does, is he not in the process of becoming? And if he is in the process of becoming, does he not face the future? Becoming means we're oriented towards a future of possibilities for enactment. That's everyday existence. We are always in the process of enacting possibilities that have to do with our survival, that have to do with our relationships, that have to do with our becoming a human being, right? All right, so that's very, very important, this notion of facing forward, facing towards the future. Does he in fact exist? And if he does, is he not in the process of becoming? If he is in the process of becoming, does he not face the future? And does he ever face the future by way of action? How do we incarnate possibilities? How do we enact the possibilities that confront us every day? Through action, right? In action. So the speculative philosopher doesn't act, he or she thinks. Well, thinking is a kind of action. Yes, I know, but there's a limit to the old phrase, ideas have consequences. That was, of course, made famous by idealistic philosophy of the Hegelian German type. You know, it's all ideas that move history. But is it ideas that move history? Do ideas move anything, really? There's a transition from thinking to acting that is the important aspect that gets missed by speculative thinking. To think existence speculatively is thus to ignore the difficulty. What's the difficulty? Well, we have to face the future, whatever that future may bring. And we have possibilities that we are responsible for enacting or not enacting, as the case may be. Here we have again the example of the fact that the simplest tasks are the most difficult. Existing is ordinarily regarded as no very complex matter, much less an art, since all of us exist. But really to exist, to become an existing individual, that is truly difficult. So, Kierkegaard wants to correct a mode of thinking in philosophy and also in the theology of his day, which confused thinking with acting, which forgot this important bridge of choice. We can speculate about all the most wonderful, say, ethical ideals and so on, but that doesn't necessarily mean those ideals are going to come into practice. Being an ethical individual is to enact our ethical ideals, how difficult that is, of course. All right, I need to move on here a little bit. I'll pause for questions in a little bit, but I want to get through this corrective bit first. Move on to another aspect of existence in Kierkegaard's day, and perhaps universally, that Kierkegaard's authorship is designed to correct. And that is the crowd, what he calls the crowd. And here it's pretty obvious whenever he talks about the crowd. It's this idea of mindless conformism, being swept up in the zeitgeist, or being swept up in what everyone is supposed to think and what everyone is supposed to do, and so on and so forth. In later existentialist philosophy, and that last bit that I read about the difficulties of existence is sort of a Magna Carta of existentialism. Well, Kierkegaard's treatment of what the existentialists call mass man, or the mass or aggregate, being a number in the human aggregate, only a number and not a unique existing individual. That, of course, becomes a huge theme in people like Heidegger and Sartre and Camus and Gabriel Marcel, and those are names of existentialist philosophers in the generations following Kierkegaard. Now, it would be interesting to speculate what Kierkegaard might say if he were transported to our own age, when what he calls the crowd has morphed into the cloud. And the opportunities aplenty for mindless conformism these days, but that's something to think about on your own. All right, any questions about the corrective before we get on to topics beyond that? Remember that corrective for Kierkegaard means not normative. He's restoring an imbalance by overemphasizing certain things. Question?
Can you just explain the distinction between the crowd and Christendom? I mean,
Christendom is the crowd, is ecclesiastically and culturally the crowd that Kierkegaard was talking about. Yeah, in part. So that being a number in the aggregate, where the aggregate is monolithically Christian and Lutheran, means, well, if you're a number, you're a Christian, right? You're a number in the aggregate. Yeah, I think that's, well, a good question. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Could you explain how speculative philosophy, what the connection is between speculative philosophy and Kierkegaard and Christendom?
I'll talk about that next time when we go into Kierkegaard's life and works, because it's going to be crucial for that. So I'm going to deflect the question for now. I need to move on. So, if Kierkegaard is offering a corrective in his writings, and that corrective became increasingly unpopular over the course of Kierkegaard's career, he was celebrated as an important author, something of a cause célèbre, when he was writing these pseudonymous works that kind of looked at various ways of thinking and living that human beings could enact and so on, but not necessarily Kierkegaard's own views. But as Kierkegaard became more and more explicit about what his own views of some of these cultural abuses and imbalances were, he became more and more ostracized, more and more thought of as a kind of outlier, contrarian, even a religious fanatic and sectarian. Now, Kierkegaard had to toe a very, very fine line, because on the one hand, he was offering a corrective of the prevailing Christendom, increasingly poignant, increasingly barbed, increasingly difficult to deal with, and increasingly bitter as the end of his career materialized. But on the other hand, he didn't want to appear, and because he wasn't, a sectarian. I talked a little bit about this last time. A sectarian, a schismatic, religious fanatic, and so on. And he had a difficult time making sure that his readers didn't think of him as some type of pseudo-apostle who is sort of coming up out of the weeds here to completely undermine the established church or the institutional church and create a new version of Christianity. And part of the problem was there were a few of those types, as it were, in Denmark at this time. And one of them was a fellow by the name of Magister Adler, not to be confused with Mortimer Adler, who was a great Catholic philosopher in America, long since passed away. Magister Adler was originally a clergy person in the State Lutheran Church. He shared some of Kierkegaard's misgivings about what Kierkegaard calls Christendom, but he went in a sectarian and indeed fanatical direction. And Kierkegaard wrote a really important work, probably one of his least appreciated works, called On Authority and Revelation, the book on Adler. He excerpted a bit of that and did publish it, called On the Difference Between a Genius and an Apostle, okay? Magister Adler was a self-appointed apostle. He claimed apostolic authority. He claimed to have divine revelations about how to create a new church or how to create a new version of Christianity and so on. I mean, the church has had to deal with that sort of thing throughout the centuries, right? And there's nothing new with that, but Kierkegaard had to disclaim that he had any apostolic authority, and in his work on Authority and Revelation, the difference between a genius and an apostle, basically he's trying to show that Magister Adler may have been a quote-unquote religious genius, by which Kierkegaard means a fanatic, a bogus apostle. He is not an apostle. The apostles died out in the first century, and divine revelation came, the New Testament anyway, came through the apostles, the followers of Christ who were designated as such. And that authority is not something that a person can just claim willy-nilly, much less something that can be based on some additional divine revelation and so on. So why am I emphasizing this? Well, if you read Kierkegaard's edifying and Christian discourses, quite frequently in the preface or on the front page and so on, Kierkegaard insists that he is without authority, that he is addressing the discourse from an individual to individuals, those individuals who are his readers. Now, that brings us to our next topic, D on the outline, the existing individual, my category. So Kierkegaard is just an individual struggling with his own existence before God, his own task of following Christ, disclaiming any apostolic authority, disclaiming any sectarian ambitions, and he's addressing his own, bearing his own soul, as it were, to any particular individual who may pick up his works, my reader, as he calls him or her. So there are two categories here, two themes that are correlative. The existing individual, my category, says Kierkegaard, and that is correlative to the individual who is my reader. That particular or singular individual, as Kierkegaard says, who is my reader. Individual to individual. Now, a lot has been written, some critically, about Kierkegaard's supposed individualism. And we have to pause here to make sure that we don't misunderstand Kierkegaard's category, as he calls it, my category of the individual. What he's talking about here is precisely this task of becoming a unique individual human being before God, the vocation of being called by God to be a complete self, which of course none of us ever achieve in this life. We have a little help from God's grace, but still we're always on the way, right? So it would be, I think, a big mistake to think of Kierkegaard according to American ideas of individualism. Kierkegaard is not a libertarian. He is not the Rand Paul of the 19th century Denmark. In fact, he has a very high view of structures and institutions, not of Christendom, but he has no problems with there being a state. In fact, his family was well known in the circles of the king and queen of Denmark, and so Kierkegaard was not trying to undermine legitimate political or legitimate ecclesiastical authority. He was not a libertarian. And he's also not saying that in this task of becoming an existing individual, we have to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, by the sheer force of our will. Clearly, that would be a misreading of Kierkegaard. So we have to make a very important distinction here before I read text number 7, and that is the distinction between authenticity, which is what Kierkegaard is about, a big theme in existentialist philosophy, becoming an authentic self, an authentic human being, a human being that is aware of this task of negotiating the challenges and difficulties of existence in the task of creating a unified narrative of one's life. Authenticity, coming apart from the crowd and learning to move from the deepest resources of one's inwardness, to use another Kierkegaardian word. So we distinguish between authenticity and autonomy. Kierkegaard is not saying that the ideal is to be an autonomous self, autonomos, a law, nomos, unto oneself. He's not saying that. Clearly, his Christian writings are opposed to this idea that we can sort of pull ourselves up by our own moral bootstraps or whatever by the sheer force of our will. No, that would certainly disqualify him as a great Christian thinker, because that would read out of the whole question the grace of God, the sacraments of the church, and so he never denied any of that. So his category of the existing individual is one that calls us to authentic, not autonomous existence. And I tend to think our American understanding of individualism very much is one of autonomy. Another perhaps helpful phrase here is a phrase from St. Augustine. Kierkegaard may well have been familiar with it, I'm not absolutely sure. It's a Latin phrase, cor ad cor loquitur. Heart speaks to heart. I am an existing individual struggling with becoming a Christian, and I'm speaking to you, my reader. You as an existing individual who can appropriate and utilize some of what I'm saying in your own, negotiating your own authentic or becoming an authentic self. All right, so let us read selection 7 in the texts here. Let me find it first. These are not necessarily totally in order. So, all right, so this is from Kierkegaard's famous set of discourses called Purity of Heart. And just a little disclaimer here. You can purchase a book by Soren Kierkegaard, go online, purchase it, called Purity of Heart. And Purity of Heart is the main topic of these edifying discourses, quote unquote. But actually, Kierkegaard never produced a work called Purity of Heart. He produced a work called 18 Edifying Discourses in Various Spirits, of which the Purity of Heart part is the first third, all right? But the whole book is a rather massive undertaking to read. I strongly recommend, as possibly good Lenten reading, to get a hold of the edition of, that's called Purity of Heart. It's severe, it's monastic, it's, as Kierkegaard writes in the preface, preparatory to the Feast of Confession, which would have been something analogous to what gets Lent going in our tradition, and they did have Lent in the Lutheran Church of Kierkegaard's day. It's great Lenten reading. All right, and this is just one little snippet from Purity of Heart. And you also need to be able to understand what he means by the phrase purity of heart is to will one thing. And I'll get at that in just a moment. But this has to do with the existing individual and what it means to be an authentic individual. The question is then whether you live in such a way that you are conscious of being an individual. It is the serious question of what each person really is, authentically is, according to his eternal vocation, so that he or she shall be conscious that he is following it, and what is even more serious, to ask whether he is considering his life before God, in the presence of God. That consciousness is the fundamental condition for willing one thing. And my gloss on the phrase willing one thing here is spiritual integrity. That's not Kierkegaard's language. But so you don't get the impression that, oh, you know, if you have a particular preoccupation in life and you pursue it with the force of your will, that makes you pure of heart. That, you know, golfing is your thing. And so you're out there on the golf course all the time with just, you know, almost fanatical zeal. That's not what Kierkegaard means by willing one thing. He means willing the good in truth. What is the good? Well, we may talk about that in the fourth session. But the in truth part means without evasion and self-deception. Willing the good without evasion or self-deception, which results in what I'm calling here spiritual integrity. Let me find my place here. That consciousness is the fundamental condition for willing one thing, spiritual integrity. For he who is not himself a unity is never really anything, wholly and decisively. Decisively is the key word here. Decisively, who are you? Who do you want to be? Who are you becoming? Great questions to reflect on during Lent, right? He only exists in an external sense, the one who ignores the eternal vocation, as long as he lives as a numeral within the crowd. Here he's bringing in that notion of the crowd. So if you live just going along with what's expected of you in your set, in your milieu, in your zeitgeist, to believe and to do and to so on, you're ignoring your eternal vocation. You are, in this case, a fraction within the earthly conglomeration. Alas, how indeed should such a one decide to busy himself with the task of willing the good in truth? I'll pause for a question or two if there is one at this time. Bruce?
Does the two
that's not Bruce.
instances
My visual deficiencies are... Go ahead.
Do the two words decisively and decide matter because they are the essential prerequisite for action?
Yes. All these themes and concepts are interrelated. Yeah, you're getting a sense of how they are organically interrelated. Any other questions at this point? Yes, John?
You might want to defer this to later, but to go back to the Christendom thing,
Yeah.
do you have reflections on what's the same with our situation here in America in 2022 in Denmark, and what's different? You know, we talk about a post-Christendom or a post-Christian society, and yet at the same time, we're certainly more polarized and
we certainly
politicized
are.
in Denmark. But any reflections on same and different?
That's a huge topic.
Yeah.
And let me say just one thing. It might seem as if, Kierkegaard's corrective is what we don't need in a so-called post-Christendom or post-Christian world. But there are a lot of movements out there which may well be mischievous to try to revive Christendom. And with that, the problems inherent in a kind of triumphalist version of Christianity. So I think Kierkegaard will warn us, if as Christians we think we're beleaguered and a minority and so on, that's okay. We will always be a beleaguered minority in a sense. We hope more and more people, espouse the Christian faith. And so Kierkegaard is saying, we shouldn't, put the kibosh on missions work or something like that. But his point is, and we went over this last time, is that it's a disastrous mistake to think that if you have a massively Christian culture, even worse, a Christian theocracy, that makes everyone a Christian. So I think Kierkegaard would be worried about some of the maybe theocratic movements that at least some sectors of the Christian churches are espousing these days. And I'm not going to get myself into trouble by going further into that. I want to move on to the next one. How do you become an existing individual, an authentic, not autonomous, but authentic existing individual? Well, Kierkegaard's famous theory, if that's the right word, of the 3 stages helps to make explicit what the process of becoming a full human being is. 3 stages or spheres of existence: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. If a person knows nothing else about Kierkegaard, just has a sort of very general knowledge or whatever from secondary sources, this is one thing you're going to take away. It's one of the most famous things in Kierkegaard. But we need to expound the words stages and spheres. These are 2 words in Danish that Kierkegaard uses for these 3 ways of life. The Danish word stages, stadier, and the Danish word spheres, sfæren, are a little tricky to understand. The word stages, the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious might seem to indicate that Kierkegaard is expounding a developmental psychology here. A little bit like, say, Kohlberg's stages of moral development. That's not what he's doing. He's not saying that we all sort of start in the aesthetic stage, and then, when we're party animals and, young and away at college and having a great time, sort of young hedonists, and so on. But then, we settle down and get a life and have a family and become responsible, ethical, presumably human beings, good citizens, whatever. And then as we approach old age and the ending of our lives, we get religion because we're worried about eternity or something. That's not what he is saying. The word stages can seem like that. And that's why I think he also uses the Danish words for spheres. They're concentric spheres of existence. But I think the word stages will be helpful if we think of it according to certain English cognates, right? We can talk about stages in a necessary, uniform psychological or moral development, and that's, again, not what Kierkegaard is saying. But we could also think of it in terms of all the world's a stage. A famous monologue from Shakespeare. We enact our existence on the stage of the temporal world of which we are a part. So we could also say that the 3 stages are staging grounds for becoming a self. So that kind of clarifies it a little bit. All right, so staging grounds or contexts for the enacting of our existence, each stage or sphere corresponds to the question, what is the focus of your life? If the focus of your life is, this is Kierkegaard's own word, enjoyment, then you are in the aesthetic sphere or stage. You live for the sake of enjoyment. That enjoyment could be something as, I suppose, crude as sensual pleasure. Or it could be something much more refined. You could be living for the sake of the pleasures, the exalted pleasures of the fine arts, or philosophy even, or whatever. Philosophy is a great pleasure for those who pursue it, sometimes at least. Depends upon the philosophy. But anyway, so there are many different kinds of pleasures, from the crude to the refined, but nevertheless, it's a life centered on enjoyment. So what is the focus of your life? Is it enjoyment, or is it living responsibly? Well, if that's the focus of your life, doing the right thing, living up or trying to live up to your highest moral ideals, trying to be a good citizen, a good father or mother, a good parent, a good spouse, a good whatever, all right, then you're in the ethical stage or ethical sphere. And if the focus of your life is, and here I'm going to use a phrase Kierkegaard uses, usually not in connection with the religious stage, although he would agree that this is essential to the religious stage. He uses another word, and we'll get to that in a moment. But the phrase I'm going to use is obedient faith. Faithfulness to God and to our Christian calling. If that's the focus of our existence, we're in the religious stage. Although there's going to be some refinements and distinctions made within each of these stages, and we'll get to that probably in the final of the 4 sessions. So I'm not going to say anything more about what each of these stages is, except to say that they are ordered according to an intensifying concern for becoming a full human being, an existing individual, and so on. And once again, they're not a developmental psychology. I'll say a whole lot more about the 3 stages at a later session. So I'm going to move on to the next theme, and so on, again, linked to everything that I've said up to now, and that is this important Kierkegaardian theme of inwardness, or subjective truth. We've already touched on this a bit, but I'm going to read a text that I think will get us into this important topic. It's text number 4, and let me find it first. Text number 4. Text number 3. Text number 4. Give me a second to get myself oriented. Text number 4. There it is. All right. So this is the one entitled The Subjective Truth, Inwardness, Truth is Subjectivity. And this is, frankly, a controversial bit from Kierkegaard's Concluding on Scientific Postscript. And one doesn't have to agree with the philosopher to appreciate the philosopher. And remember, once again, we have to keep this always in mind. Kierkegaard's thought is a corrective, not necessarily a balanced, normative articulation of anything. So let me read this. When the question of truth is raised in an objective manner, reflection is directed objectively to the truth as an object to which the knower is related. Reflection in this case is not focused upon the relationship to the truth, however, but upon the question of whether it is the truth to which the knower is related. Now, Kierkegaard is not dissing this question of whether I am related to the truth, whether it is the truth to which I am related, whatever it is I'm thinking about, when I'm pondering whether a certain belief or a certain proposition is true. We call them propositions in logic, sentences, assertions, whatever. Now, Kierkegaard's not saying that that's an unimportant question, but remember, he's turning his readers towards the whole question of becoming an existing individual, the existentialist question. All right, and so he's going to downplay, relatively speaking, as part of his corrective, the importance of what he just said here. And he's going to emphasize the next. When the question of the truth is raised subjectively, reflection is directed subjectively to the nature of the individual's relationship, if only the mode of this relationship is in the truth. The individual is in the truth, even if he should happen to be related to what is not true. So what is Kierkegaard saying here? It's difficult, right? It's difficult. It's your turn. Yes. Is there a hand up over here? I thought I saw a hand. I'm sorry. Anyone want to jump into the fray? What is Kierkegaard saying about subjective truth, or what he calls inwardness? Is he saying that, whatever you want to believe it? It's true for you? Well, he has been taken to be saying something like a crude relativism. He's not. Nor is he a subjectivist. And I can't go into all the reasons why. Read my dissertation from 40 years ago. Go ahead.
Well, I think Martin Buber was influenced by Kierkegaard very
He
strongly.
sure was.
And Buber's whole point in all of his work, but especially in I and Thou, is that truth of relationship between persons, between beings.
Yes.
Not between a being and its object.
Right.
And so you can't know a person the way you can know an object. And so the truth in that case, being a person, Christ,
Yes.
you enter into relation with the truth. You don't own it, you don't objectify it, you don't control it. It isn't your thing.
Right. I think that's exactly what he's saying. There is the dimension of personal truth, or the relation between persons, including the relation between the individual and God, individual and Christ. So this task of becoming a person in full, becoming an existing individual, and so on, has to do with this notion of cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaking to heart. That's where the truth of human relationship and the human-divine relationship comes into being. And it's a different order of truth, and in some respects more important for us as human beings, from Kierkegaard's point of view anyway, than whether a particular statement or a particular belief is objectively true. I'll offer you a little illustration here. I hope it works. This is a difficult passage. I can ask Siri to recite the Nicene Creed. You know who Siri is, right? Right. So she, quote unquote, will recite the Nicene Creed. The only thing is Siri's not a person. And here I'll beg off of questions of artificial intelligence and whether artificial intelligence is personal. No. Clearly Siri is not a person. So there's nothing in it for Siri because Siri doesn't really exist as a person. However, hopefully when we recite the Nicene Creed at church or the Lord's Prayer, whenever you please, we're not just, doing something mechanical. I mean, we unfortunately can be sometimes, but we call ourselves back to, I believe in God the Father Almighty. I believe in Christ. I believe in the Holy Spirit. Yes, there's something in it here for me as a person. I have a stake in this. It is existentially poignant, existentially pregnant, existentially important. It is a matter of, here I'm going to use a phrase from the Protestant theologian Paul Tillich, who got a lot from Kierkegaard. He uses this phrase, ultimate concern. It's an ultimate concern who Christ is, and who God is, and what God's will for my life is, etc., etc. And I think that's what Kierkegaard is getting at with this notion of truth is subjectivity. However,
Let me offer an example from seminary teaching. I can be lecturing on, say, the attributes of God, one of which is the holiness of God, or a topic like sanctification, which is becoming a holier person. So my job is to, of course, teach the students what the Bible and the tradition says about that. But I think Kierkegaard is saying, well, you want to be a more holy person. In other words, how do you connect your life with this objective truth of your Christian faith? And I think in our context, that's the application side, is what has often been missing, I would say, in my teaching and some of my Christian experience.
Yeah, so here's one of the risks of being a theologian or a Christian philosopher, for that matter. This is the hall of mirrors. That you get so wrapped up in reflecting on the objective truth, and that's important. Kierkegaard is not denying that, but we have to call ourselves back to the task of following Christ, which ain't easy from Kierkegaard's point of view. Anyway, that was helpful, Jack. Thank you. Very much for that. And I want to end this topic with just a word about Kierkegaard's gloss on Christ's famous saying, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." We usually, when we think of that famous passage from the Gospel of John, we sort of think of these as three separate ideas, three separate aspects of who Christ is. Christ is the way to salvation, or what? Christ is the truth, God's truth, revealed truth. Christ is the life, eternal life through Christ, and so on. That's not wrong. But Kierkegaard interconnects all of these. For Kierkegaard, not just in terms of the truth of the Christian faith, but also in terms of anything we aspire to be that's better than where we've been, okay? It's always going to be the case that the truth is a way for us. We enact the truth. We're creating a narrative, I keep coming back to that, a story throughout our whole lives. So the way is the truth. The way incarnates the truth of our being, and we're talking about Christian truth. The way of following Christ incarnates, at least in a minor key, a very minor key, the example that Christ's life imposes upon us. So the truth is manifested in the way, and the way over time becomes a life, incarnational truth. And this gets into Boomer and existentialist philosophy and so on that is non-Christian, as well as Christian existentialism. The emphasis is on becoming and being the truth in our inward and outward being, creating this life story. And of course, if the life story that we are creating is an aspect of, to go back to an earlier text we were looking at, our eternal vocation, what God calls me uniquely to be. And I don't know, you don't know in advance what that is, because our life is still ongoing. And that's the risk. And that's the risk involved in faith. And next time, because I see the hour is rapidly entering the last couple of minutes here, we're going to begin with item H, the leap of faith, and what Kierkegaard has to say about risky faith. And then we'll double back to paradox and continue on with these topics. And then we'll go on to a new bit. However much time I have, next time I will, after we get through these initial themes and topics of Kierkegaard, I'll do a brief review of Kierkegaard's life and works. He had a very interesting, very difficult life, a broken life in many ways, from a broken background. And so we'll say something, and we won't have texts and so on to illustrate, so we can cover that, I think, in the last like 15 or 20 minutes or maybe even half hour. And then in the final period, we'll go back to this notion of the three stages, the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious, and go into that more deeply. If we have any time next time for that, we might, but we may or may not. Thank you very much for coming today, and we'll see you hopefully next week for more of these themes in Kierkegaard, as well as Kierkegaard's life and works. And if you could leave both handouts, or actually, the table here on the my extreme left, under the window, has the two handouts. If you could just hand them in, you can take them if you want, but we will need them again next time. So if you want to take the texts and look them over, or the outline for that, then you certainly can do that, but bring them next time so we don't have to make additional copies. Thank you very much. We'll see you later.